Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We know now what we've all been waiting to know for the last 16 days. Who was going to join Vice President Kamala Harris on the ticket this cycle? We now know that it is the governor of Minnesota, Tim Walz, perhaps not known to many, but maybe known to some, in part because of his viral cataloging of J.D. Vance and Donald Trump as weird. Remember this on CNN earlier this summer?
People kept talking about, look, Donald Trump is going to put women's lives at risk. That's 100% true. Donald Trump is potentially going to end constitutional liberties that we have, end voting. I do believe all those things are a real possibility, but it gives him way too much power. Listen to the guy. He's talking about Hannibal Lecter and shocking sharks and just whatever crazy thing pops into his mind. And I thought we just give him way too much credit.
Weird, crazy. There you have it from Tim Walz. Fast forward, Kailey, a week and change, and he's now on the Democratic ticket. We're going to be seeing him at 5:30 Eastern time, or so goes the schedule, alongside Kamala Harris at Temple University in Philadelphia. So we've got a race here, and the sprint begins as we bring in Gregory Korte, Bloomberg Politics reporter with us at the table here. Gregory, you've been covering this campaign cycle since the beginning. It's not till now that we actually have a race, which is kind of remarkable here in the throes of August on our way to the Chicago convention. Republicans have been trying to frame Kamala Harris, trying to identify her. They've got another job here to try to identify an essentially unknown politician when it comes to most households, and a race to frame this person into something that can help one side or the other. How's this going to work out?
Yeah, he is pretty much a blank slate for most voters. And so both sides will try to sort of, as you say, frame up some sort of a reference point for who is this guy and what does it say about Kamala Harris that she chose him as her running mate. I think what we've already seen from Republicans is that he is an extreme liberal. I'm not sure how that's going to play. He is sort of a middle American. He's got a life story that is born in a small town. Went into the Army National Guard, rose to the rank of command sergeant major. So this isn't an officer. This is the highest ranking enlisted man ever to serve in Congress. He was a teacher and a football coach before he decided to run for Congress. So those are the things we're going to hear from Democrats. But he also does have a very progressive streak as a governor. He instituted paid leave and childcare, free lunch and breakfast at public schools, LGBTQ rights, abortion rights, a whole litany of progressive policy positions. So, yeah, he is somebody who, depending on how you look at him, could be either a very moderate or very liberal.
Well, when we think more critically about some of those quote unquote progressive policy positions, free lunch for school children, paid family leave, are these ideas that are actually unpopular, or are these actually, whether or not you cast them as left, right, or center, things that most of America would sign on to too?
Oh, I think the what we can now call the Harris-Walz ticket hopes that they are very popular, and they are. If you isolate any one of these policies in isolation and you poll them, these are very popular things. What Republicans are going to try to do is sort of put them in a package of very expensive nanny state proposals that are big, a sign of how she's going to be big government, big spending liberal in the mold of what we have seen from Joe Biden with his Building Back Better agenda that is focused on this sort of care infrastructure of American life.
People were just as surprised to learn as it was Tim Walz as we're surprised to learn it was not Josh Shapiro, which really seemed to be the narrative going into this day. The tip sheets were maybe onto something this morning in a slightly different way. But the statement from Josh Shapiro is striking if you read this. This came a couple of hours after the news leaked. As I've said repeatedly over the past several weeks, the running mate decision was a deeply personal decision for the vice president. And it was also a deeply personal decision for me, he says. Pennsylvanians elected me to a 4-year term as their governor, and my work here is far from finished, suggesting that this was some sort of mutual decision. I'm guessing the campaign didn't approve of this statement.
Look, I mean, this is part of the game of selecting a vice president. And if you can read the writing on the wall as a potential running mate and see that you're not going to get it anyway, as perhaps Roy Cooper, the governor of North Carolina, did, and withdraw your name from consideration, saying it's not the right time, or for personal reasons or family reasons or whatever have you, it's better to sort of bow out early. I think there's a lot of face saving here. In the end, I'm not sure how much of that really matters. I mean, there's only one person who can be vice president at a time. There's only one other person she can put on the ticket. She had, I think her campaign would say she had a lot of good Democrats to choose from. Yeah. The fact that she waited just as Trump did, right? But to the last possible self-imposed deadline to make this decision, just hours before she's set to appear with this candidate, means that this was something that she spent a good amount of time over the past few days really sort of agonizing over.
All right, Gregory Korte, who covers all things politics for us here at Bloomberg. Thank you so much. It took a little bit longer than we thought, but the pick is in. And we get reaction now from our signature political panel. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors, are with us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. So obviously we know at this point, guys, Walz has been well received by Democrats. From the AOC end of the spectrum all the way to Joe Manchin of West Virginia, it does seem that his candidacy is being welcomed with open arms. So for me, it's not even just a question of the Democratic reaction. It's the question of the Republican one, Rick, because they too also seem quite happy with this pick. Is Tim Walz the easiest one to run against?
Well, he doesn't control any electoral votes directly. So I know Republicans were very nervous about having to fight a rearguard action against a VP like Shapiro, who actually is in a state and is popular, who's got electoral votes that matter. So this simplifies things. They can tee off on him and there'll be no blowback. They plan to lose in Minnesota anyway. So that's one thing. Two, it does play to the sort of narrative that they've tried, and frankly, really unsuccessfully, to pin Kamala Harris on, which is, oh, well, she's much too liberal for America. Coming out of the Biden administration, Biden is seen as a centrist. Kamala Harris, they're trying to make her something other than that. And, this is their narrative. And so this kind of plays into that. Much harder to pin down other candidates like Kailey and Shapiro in that regard. So they're happy about this. They get this opportunity, and it's not without its controversy, right? We've talked a little bit about, today, the George Floyd incident and the amount of time that the vice president nominee Walz took as governor to get the National Guard out. There'll be all those kinds of things. There's plenty to talk about. The reality is this is a tough decision by Republicans because every day they go after Walz, they're not going after Kamala Harris. This is terrific for Kamala Harris because by and large, people vote on her, not on him. So if they waste a lot of time and effort and money to define Walz, they could find out that in the meantime, she has grown her image and is very popular. And right now, she's the only politician in this race that has higher positives than negatives. And they might miss that opportunity. So right now, it's kind of a tough period of time for Republicans to figure out, do they just give Walz a walk and go after Harris, or do they jump on Walz? Today, it's all Walz.
A lot of interesting labels being thrown around here. Gregory Korte just said, Jeanne, that depending on the issues you pick, you could frame Tim Walz as a liberal or a moderate. I think you described him already as a populist progressive. What is that?
Well, I was trying to differentiate him from this notion that he is progressive. Let's face it, he did get the endorsements of the more progressive wing, from Bernie Sanders to Ilhan Omar. But many people look at Tim Walz, who know him from the Midwest, and say he is something more of a populist. And something that Gregory was talking about in your conversation, this idea of populism as smaller government, stay out of our business. And Tim Walz, when you look at it, has repeatedly said the golden rule of small town America is keep to yourself, mind your own business. And that is very popular to populists. Sorry for the double wording there, as opposed to a progressive notion of big spending, economic policies. And Kailey was just talking about the fact that many of the policies he's supported, they're widely popular. And one thing, when you listen to Tim Walz defend his record, what does he say? He says, attack me anytime you want for giving every young person a free lunch at their school. That's something you can stand on. Attack me every time you want for helping subsidize the ridiculously expensive childcare costs in this country. So he's got a defense of that is very attractive. And I would just say one statement that came out in support of him by Joe Manchin that you mentioned twice used the term that Josh Wingrove is using in his article on the Terminal Now, which is normal. Bring back normality. That's what Tim Walz does. Normalcy in Washington. Can you imagine? That's another popular thing that Democrats want to talk about with this choice.
Well, Jeanne, as you bring up this notion of populism, that, of course, is also how we describe J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, maybe in different ways. But it does seem that there is an attempt here to appeal to the exact same kind of voter, one in which populist messaging does resonate, specifically the American worker. We know that labor has come out in favor of Governor Walz, but labor is also a group that Trump and Vance are trying to attract. So what is the messaging that wins them over, and how much daylight is there actually between the policies that both are likely to pursue?
You know, I think this is a really smart choice just for that reason you described, because what the Democrats will try to do is co-opt some of those moderate independents, maybe even soft, never Trump Republicans who they need to win in these 7 swing states. And you just take one example, an issue like gun control. Tim Walz is famously somebody who has guns, who uses guns, is a Second Amendment advocate, but he comes to it saying we can have smart policies where people who use guns and are educated to use them and trained to use them can use them and have them in their homes, but we can do so safely, all the while protecting our young people in their schools. That's attractive to many people in the middle. Yes, let people have their guns, but let's do so in a commonsensical way. If you're not going to be able to have a gun, if you're on a terrorist watch list, maybe you're not allowed to have one at all. So he comes to it with that kind of approach that is attractive to people in the middle. If they can co-opt those people, they feel that they have a shot in some of these hard to reach middle of America towns and cities that are going to be so important in this blue wall.
Reaching young people and reaching folks who may not always be politically active or interested is another part of this, Jeanne, and it's something that we talked a lot about, the chemistry between these two, but also the personality, the way they project themselves in different forums here. And I'm compelled by Tim Walz's command of social media, the number of young people who are aware of him from his cooking videos, this type of thing, something Kamala Harris has gotten involved in, taking to Instagram or TikTok to do this kind of stuff. Here's a taste of what Tim Walz is up to online.
Just clip off the back, use some shrink wrap connectors on there, tape it back together and put it back in. It's about a 5-minute fix and you're back on the road safe and sound. So pro tip of the day, second one is get out and vote for One Minnesota.
Then you take it out, cut it, and bon appetit.
Wow. Well, Kamala, I
Bon appetit, Kamala Harris, working on dinner there. But they're not alone. Donald Trump, of course, no stranger to social media, has got his own social media company. And you might have seen him sit down for an interview with this Aiden Ross, a video gamer who's apparently very popular online. Rick, he gifted Donald Trump a Tesla Cybertruck and a Rolex, tapping into this sort of young macho guy thing online. How much of this presidential race and the bid to find people who are either undecided or not politically involved is going to find itself born here on social media?
Yeah, it's obvious that Donald Trump is leaning into sort of the social media side of the campaign. Much of his campaign is really playing out on social media. I'll admit that I don't quite understand the whole influencer craze. The idea that millions of people would follow this young man who's, painted up a Tesla truck and a watch and gave it to Donald Trump. I mean, to me, that is kind of an odd campaign event. I'm not sure I would have gone for it. But, they've probably got millions of views on, Instagram or X or True Social. So the reality is there are kind of two, different campaigns playing out. There's traditional media campaign where you hold events and you talk to the press and you buy TV advertising. And then there's an entire campaign being waged out there on social media where things like world wrestling champions prevail and folks who drive Tesla trucks seem to have a real hook. Whether or not that can actually turn out votes is a big question. I don't think anybody I know thinks that necessarily is good fruit to pick.
Jury's still out on a lot of things here with our signature panel. Great analysis from Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino just hours after the pick. Tim Walz it is. And thank you both for the insights. They were on Kick. Kailey, you familiar with the platform?
No.
Kick,
this
live
is where
streaming
I feel like
and gaming.
A bad millennial.
Yeah, you're
like
not.
I just missed the boat on a lot of these
I can't
things.
watch you gaming online.
No.
I guess we don't do that here.
You can see us here, though, on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Well, we've talked a lot about the news of the day, which is, of course, the presidential race, and more specifically, the tapping of Governor Tim Walz to be Vice President Kamala Harris's running mate. The current president of the United States has been busy today, too. A readout just coming from the National Security Council spokesman saying that he just got off the phone with the leaders of Qatar and Egypt, discussing diplomatic efforts to de-escalate tension in the Middle East, in the region, and bring a ceasefire and hostage release deal to a conclusion. It's a reminder to us all, Joe, that we are still awaiting retaliation from Iran and its proxies against Israel for the Israeli strikes we've seen against Hezbollah and Hamas leaders in recent weeks.
We know the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, met with top officials from Qatar and Egypt as well just yesterday. So we have an interesting moment here. We should also remind our listeners and viewers, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were together in the Situation Room yesterday being briefed on Iran-backed militia attacks against Americans in Iraq. This is a very delicate moment we're in. But Kailey, I will say that the narrative has changed a bit here. We're seeing references to a response from Iran as a work in progress and hope among American officials that they can prevent a retaliatory strike. We'll see how all of that goes. As Kailey mentioned, I'm glad to be joined here at the table by Michael Allen, of course, Beacon Global Strategies and a reliable voice of ours when it comes to national security issues. Michael, it's good to see you and welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Could we be in a world where there is no retaliation?
It won't be for long.
Yeah.
I think the Iranians have telegraphed that they feel like they have to do it. They were embarrassed by the fact that they had a very senior Hamas political leader killed in an Iranian government facility. So I think for their own sake, their own deterrence, their own toughness in the region, and the appearance that they need to give to their proxies, they have to do something. The question is, what do they do directly from their own territory versus what do their proxies do? I don't think it's either or. I think both will act in some way, shape, or form, but I know the Iranians want to do it differently than last time. Last time everything was intercepted. I think they actually want to feel like they landed a punch this time.
Well, as we think back to April, and it's been described to us as Iran having sent its slowest things first, basically giving Israel forewarning that the attack was coming. Do you think they won't do that this time around? That not just Israel, but the other allies who came to Israel's defense, including the U.S., won't have as much time to prepare a response?
I really do think that they will not, to the degree that they telegraphed last time, and that's still up for debate. I think they do less of it this time around, because I think they, at the end of the day, were probably losers in the equation. No people were killed, no major damage, certainly no damage to Israeli military facilities. So I think they want to be able to have a talking point. They want to claim a scalp. They want to say that we're tough and that we did something and that we're the regional hegemon. And so I think there'll be less telegraphing and more trying to actually land a punch.
You wonder to what extent that de-escalates things. You were a special assistant to the president in the Bush administration. Someone else has your old job now. What are they telling Joe Biden about the various scenarios to plan for here? Do you let Iran land a punch, knowing that that might be the end of the tit for tat? How do you keep guardrails on this thing without getting too involved?
So as you know, we have the head of Central Command is in the region coordinating with the Israelis. I think that we're going to do as much or more than we did last time.
More?
To try to prevent drones, missiles, whatever the case may be, from getting into Israel proper. I think that's a very appropriate role for the United States, and I'm certain that we've tried to knit up others like the Saudis and the UAE and the region to contribute as much as they possibly can. But what I think Biden's thinking about right now is what happened last night in Baghdad. Did they target directly our troops at the Air Force base there? And or will they go after directly other U.S. embassies or naval platforms or whatever the case may be in the region? I don't think they'll go for it, but we have to be ready for it because Hezbollah took a shot at us. Israel, of course, killed one of their leaders. And I think the way the Iranians view things is that we're complicit in whatever Israel does.
Well, and the U.S. has tried and true come to the defense of Israel, but has consistently decided not to go on offense in many ways, as especially you bring up the attack on the base in Iraq last night that we saw, and a number of U.S. personnel were injured. Do you expect the U.S. could actually be offensive in the region if things escalate further?
So we've all been trying to look at what Biden said previously about what his personal red lines are. Was it actually that an American get injured or that an American die? To me, that's dancing on the head of a pin. They took a shot at us. The United States ought to hit back against them in some proper way. I think we have to worry about our own deterrence in the region, so I might lean a little bit more hawkish than someone else. But yeah, I think it is something that is on Biden's plate right now. They took a shot at our people. We want to prevent them from doing this. Remember, they were able to kill several some months ago now at a different installation that we had in Syria, and we just don't want that to happen again.
We talk about all this from a distance here as we sit in Washington, but as you referenced, could be the same or more support that we saw last time. There were American fighter jets shooting down missiles with air-to-air missiles in the middle of that operation. How high could the risk get for American pilots and navigators in the middle of all of this?
Well, I think it depends on how many ballistic missiles and drones the Iranians try to go right now.
It's the equivalent of boots on the ground, though. We're just in the air.
It sort of sounds like it, doesn't it? I mean, we're over Israeli airspace, probably Saudi and UAE airspace at different times, trying to knock all of these out. I just don't think the Iranians are going to do it exactly like last time. Not that it was easy last time, but we were able to achieve what we wanted to achieve. They're going to make it harder this go around. I think the Israelis have to be prepared that some of this is going to go through, even if in the aggregate the United States has sent more squadrons and more other equipment and the like to the region.
So, of course, all of this is happening against the backdrop of the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas, which is very highly political here in the U.S., if you will, and some would argue played a role in the selection of the vice president that Kamala Harris announced today. There are some in the Republican Party suggesting that the choice not to tap Governor Josh Shapiro, who is Jewish, was an anti-Semitic one, and it was bowing to the pro-Hamas forces within the Democratic Party. What do you think about that idea?
I think that there's probably a little bit to it, because I think what Kamala Harris probably wants to do most of all is play it safe. I don't think it was the decisive factor, but was it one among many? Do they want to have another big fight about what the Democratic administration's policy is on Israel, and especially two-state solution and the rest? I don't think that was the number one factor, but I bet at the back of their mind they're thinking, we're trying to unite the party. We're trying to put everything back together. Let's not find an issue that splits us.
Well, it's been suggested, though, that Kamala Harris is not the same, even though in the same administration, not the same when it comes to Israel as Joe Biden. John Kirby says there's no sunlight between them. Most people in Washington don't see it that way. How about you?
Well, Kirby has to say that, of course, because she still serves in the Biden administration. But I even thought her body language when Bibi was in town last week was a little bit more perfunctory than it is around Biden. I can just sort of tell with her record and the ways that I think that she's responded to some of these issues in the past. She's more in tune, I believe, with what the progressive wing of the Democratic Party thinks about Israel. Of course, Netanyahu is unpopular almost with all Democrats and even maybe many Republicans. So if Netanyahu's not there, maybe things change a little bit were Harris to win. But for now, I think it's a safe bet to assume that she would be a little bit harder on a Bibi Netanyahu administration than would be certainly Trump, but obviously Biden also.
Well, and of course, Netanyahu's facing domestic pressures of his own, specifically pressure to get the hostages home to agree to some kind of ceasefire deal. Do you realistically think that happens while President Biden is still in office?
I'm increasingly thinking it's just not on the table. I mean, when you go and kill the head political leader for Hamas, who is an interlocutor of yours, as you try to negotiate to get a hostage deal, I feel like what the Israelis are saying is that this is not even at the very top of our priority list. What's at the top is going after Hamas, finishing up whatever we can do there. If their targets there or not anymore, I know that's something that the Israeli generals have been communicating. But I think Netanyahu's ready to move on to Hezbollah. I think in his mind that he cannot live with another genocidal terrorist organization on a second border like it occurred in the south with Gaza and Hamas. I feel like he's determined to go in. That was certainly the feeling I get the more Israelis I talk to. So I think reestablishing Israeli deterrence around the region and resetting things in the Middle East for Israel are at the top of his list. And I don't think the hostage deal is at least among the top 2 or 3 priorities he has.
All right. Well, we have to continue to watch things in the Middle East as they develop. Thank you for helping us do so. Michael Allen, Managing Director and Partner at Beacon Strategies, and as Joe mentioned, former Special Assistant to the President during the Bush administration.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
As we add the voice of Andra Gillespie, Professor of Political Science at Emory University. Professor, it's great to have you. Before I ask you about Tim Walz and this selection, I just want to finish with what we were discussing there with Laura, and that's the idea that Josh Shapiro was the wrong pick. He was getting beat up for weeks about labor, about Israel, about a number of issues that had progressives concerned, and Tim Walz is apparently the antidote to all of those things. Why do you think she looked past the governor of Pennsylvania? Because we also heard about his personality. John Fetterman said he was too ambitious. He might primary Kamala Harris in 2028. Is that the real problem, or was that the real problem with him?
Well, I have no way of knowing that, so I won't speculate about those issues. What I will consider are all the pluses and minuses of each of the candidates in the way that Tim Walz checks off boxes that Vice President Harris thinks are important. When you're making a vice presidential choice, vice presidential candidates rarely make enough of a dent to actually help a candidate win an election. So people have been studying this for decades, and some of the earliest estimates suggested that perhaps you get a slight bump in the vice presidential nominee's home state. It may not be enough to make a difference in a presidential outcome unless it's a razor thin outcome. But people do look for things like balancing out the ticket and working well together. Only Vice President Harris and the people whom she interviewed can talk about what their chemistry was, but we can look at some of the ways that Tim Walz ostensibly balances out the ticket in ways that Josh Shapiro did not. So Tim Walz is somebody who is very well received by progressives in the Democratic Party, but his manner speaks very much to folks who are in the middle, that Midwestern plain spokenness. Just the idea of the invocation of weird as actually being an effective attack line against the Trump Vance machine is something that seems really natural to him as a Midwesterner. He really does kind of embody everyman populism. He's somebody who was not, a lawyer. He's not a business person. He was a high school teacher and a football coach, right? He served in the military as an enlisted person. He served in Congress where he was bipartisan and where he won in a district that was Republican. So he actually can satisfy progressives. And I think that he can make a strong case for being able to reach out to folks in the middle. He's got federal experience and he's from the Midwest. And so Josh Shapiro brought a lot of strengths to a possible ticket with Kamala Harris. But one of the things that he couldn't bring was Midwestern balance, or looking at the middle of the country instead of sort of thinking about that problem that Democrats have, currently have sort of in recent history of being perceived as being the party of coastal elites. Bringing somebody in from Minnesota who grew up in Nebraska on a farm, I think really does kind of speak to some of those attacks and might cause some folks in the middle to give the ticket a second look, even though at the end of the day, people are going to decide based on Kamala Harris and on Donald Trump and not on J.D. Vance.
Well,
and
that's one of the
Tim
smartest
Walz.
answers. One of the smartest answers I've heard yet. Midwestern balance, suggesting, Professor, that geography does matter, but not in the most obvious way that we think about with a governor delivering his or her own state. It's a different, more nuanced dynamic. And with that in mind, I'll ask you what it will be to put him on stage with J.D. Vance, if in fact there's a vice presidential debate. J.D. Vance spoke earlier today. He was on his jet. I actually called Tim Walz. He said, I left a voicemail, didn't get him, told him congratulations, it'll be a good ride. Maybe he'll call me back, maybe he won't. Should Tim Walz return that phone call, and should these two debate?
Well, I think the two should debate. I think it remains to be seen. I don't know if it harms, either candidacy one way or the other. By putting somebody who's older, whose populist roots are not going to be called into question, it actually does, in some ways, at least call out Donald Trump's choice of J.D. Vance as a spokesperson for the everyday working person. Tim Walz can more than hold his own against J.D. Vance, and it would be really interesting to see them kind of talking, in a debate and debating on those kinds of issues. I think in those particular instances, what Harris is betting on is that Walz's age is actually an advantage here. So you get the extra 20 years of life experience. You get somebody whose career did kind of, before he went into politics, focused on normal everyday politics. Whereas when J.D. Vance went to law school, he then goes off into kind of sort of, high-end business. And, and it was coming with a pedigree from Yale Law School. So I think in many ways, like, the balance is actually also a counter to what Donald Trump was hoping to achieve by selecting J.D. Vance as his spokesperson.
You talk about Midwestern balance, rural sensibility might be another way to look at it. He didn't move to St. Paul until he won the governor's race. It's going to be interesting to see these two out on the road together. Professor, they're going to be followed by J.D. Vance over the course of the next 4 stops or something like that on the road tour this week. How will Tim Walz be framed? They're going to have a video and so forth. He's going to be introduced. There's going to be a lot of people yelling and a big standing ovation. But how will he be framed by the campaign? Is it this way that we're talking? Is it Midwestern balance, rural sensibility? What is Kamala Harris going to serve up to the crowd later today in Philadelphia?
I think she's going to serve all of that up. I think she's going to talk about the notion of Minnesota nice. So the idea that Walz can be the attack dog surrogate and spokesperson that vice presidential candidate usually is, but he can do so in a way that's uplifting and that isn't mean and divisive. The idea that he can hit back hard, but still be able to hold his dignity. I think she's going to tout his bipartisan record as an overture to those voters in the middle who may still be deciding who they're going to vote for, or moderate Republicans who might still have misgivings about supporting a Trump-Vance ticket, especially as it has emerged since the Republican nominating convention. I think he's going to talk about his record of providing goods and services to Minnesotans with the legislature that he has at his disposal. So talking about things like free lunch for students and parental leave, all of these types of things that Democratic voters want to hear about and that Democratic politicians are usually trying to tout and talk about. He's actually been able to produce a record in Minnesota that actually speaks to those kinds of things.
Andra, it's really great to have you back. Associate Professor, Political Science, Emory University, Andra Gillespie. We always look forward to the conversation here.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Tim Walz, the pick for Kamala Harris's running mate. We have not seen them together yet, but we will a bit later on, 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Temple University, the venue for their first event together here, and that's going to kick off a road trip that will follow here. Knowing that was the case, we were wondering, Kailey, why it took so long for this choice to emerge. It's kind of confounding. She went to bed last night, we're told, not knowing who she was going to pick. The staff was tasked with writing multiple speeches and creating the effects for multiple events, depending on who she would pick this morning. Then the media leaked the news. It wasn't exactly the rollout that the campaign had planned.
Yeah, we do have to keep in mind, because it's easy to lose sight of, because everything has been so fast moving, but this was an incredibly truncated process.
Oh, yes.
She only found out that Joe Biden wasn't running for president and wanted her to do it 16 days ago. So she didn't have much time to think about this choice, maybe trying to soak every minute up that she could before letting the world know that it was indeed Governor Walz she selected today.
The Democratic game of apprentice. In this case, we're told they didn't know each other terribly well before they met at the Naval Observatory last weekend, but I guess hit it off in a way that that made this work. We heard a lot, Kailey, about chemistry going into this, not just geography.
Yeah, indeed we did. And of course, it is worth pointing out as you talk about the notion they may not have known each other very well. A lot of America probably doesn't know
That's correct.
Tim Walz very well, who may have been Googling when they heard the news today. Who exactly is that, unless you're part of the social media crowd that got in on the weird trend he seems to have started. So on that note, let's turn now to Matt Bennett. He is Executive Vice President for Public Affairs at Third Way and a Democratic strategist. Matt, great to have you back here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Obviously, a lot of Democrats are celebrating this decision today, but when we consider we got a guy named Tim, also being called America's dad, running with a woman, does this take you back to 2016 in a way that makes you even just a little bit nervous?
It does sound a little familiar, but I am not nervous. The context is very, very different. Back then, we were not taking Trump as seriously as we ought to. We weren't taking the third-party threats seriously. All of that has changed. We know we're in a dogfight in this election, so I'm much more confident than I would otherwise be.
So how does the Democratic Party, or how does the ticket, I guess, more specifically here, Matt Bennett, frame this person most Americans have never heard of? To Kailey's point, some know about the weird thing. He's labeled Trump and J.D. Vance and Republicans as weird, and that's stuck. They even have T-shirts saying not weird that they're wearing at the Democrat rallies here. So is this the weird versus normal campaign?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's part of it. Like, Tim Walz is about as normal a character type as you are likely to come across anywhere in American politics. I mean, he is the avuncular guy next door who can help fix your car. He's a football coach. He ice fishes. He was a very senior enlisted a guy in the United States Army and National Guard. He was a command sergeant major. I mean, he checks a lot of boxes. And of course, he's from the dead center middle of the country. He also is being characterized, I think, incorrectly as being a progressive because a lot of folks on the left were pushing for him. But in fact, if you look at his record, he's really a moderate. He was in Congress, and he is as governor, and I think he's a perfect balance to the ticket for Kamala Harris.
Well, if his record is indeed more middle of the road, Matt, it certainly isn't being characterized that way today by the opposition, already calling him a radical liberal, dangerously liberal, perhaps describing him as leftist, kind of a hard word to say. But if that already is out there percolating, how hard is it going to be for the now Harris-Walz campaign to fight back against that?
I mean, they're going to have to do it a little, but remember, they would call anybody. If she had picked Joe Manchin, he would have been a radical, leftist, communist, socialist nutcase. I mean, that's what they do. But Tim Walz is none of those things. I mean, he wanted, back in 2011, when he was in Congress, he voted for $4 trillion of deficit reduction. He was part of the pay-as-you-go caucus. He's very focused on kind of deficit and deficit reduction. He had an A+ rating from the NRA when he was in Congress. This is nobody's idea of a left-wing radical. And keep in mind, of course, that while there was a lot of focus on Walz and what he's done leading up to this and today and maybe tomorrow, after that, it's all about Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. It's the top of the ticket that people make their minds on. And so I think Walz will be a very good partner to her and will be a great surrogate for her. But ultimately, it's up to Harris to beat Trump.
Matt, what do you think of this anti-Semitic line that we're getting from the Trump campaign in Kamala Harris not choosing Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania? J.D. Vance was on the Hugh Hewitt program, said, quote, "If it's not Josh Shapiro, I agree with you." This is something that Hewitt posed to him. "I think they will have not picked Shapiro, frankly, out of anti-Semitism for their own caucus and their own party," referring to the fact that Shapiro is Jewish and has a bit of a harder line, as we've learned, when it comes to Israel policy. If this is something that we're going to be hearing in this campaign, how does she answer it?
Well, let's be clear. That is another example of J.D. Vance being awful. He has completely abandoned all principle that apparently he once had, according to his friends from law school, and now has none. That is an appalling lie. Kamala Harris is married to a Jewish man. As a Jewish person myself, I will completely reject the proposition that just because she didn't pick a Jewish guy doesn't mean she's an anti-Semite. It had absolutely, positively nothing whatsoever to do with that. And in fact, if you want to look for anti-Semitism in this race, look no further than Donald Trump, who said that there were very fine people on both sides when a bunch of Nazis chanting "Jews will not replace us" marched in Charlottesville while he was president. So that is a ridiculous thing for Vance to have said.
Yeah, it does make you wonder if everyone is familiar with the second gentleman of the United States of America. Matt, it is an excellent point. And it's also worth pointing out, it wasn't just Josh Shapiro that wasn't chosen. There were a number of other governors who were on this list, including senators as well, like Mark Kelly of Arizona. Everybody was looking to those representing actual battleground states, Matt. That is not what she went with here. Safely blue. Minnesota hasn't gone for a Republican since 1972. Is there a risk that that calculus actually backfires, that you should have had someone who could bring with him actual electoral votes that you wouldn't have had otherwise?
No, that doesn't work anymore. No vice presidential nominee has delivered their state for the ticket since LBJ did it in 1960. He delivered Texas. Since then, no one's done it. I mean, sometimes the ticket wins the VP's state. I mean, Bush won Wyoming, but it's not because Dick Cheney was on the ticket. That is just not a way that anyone who's really intimate with this process makes their calculus. The vice presidential pick probably will have limited impact. Trump was right about that the other day. But to the extent it has impact, it's really a feeling that voters will get about who Harris is and how they feel about her. That is what Walz's job is to do, is to create an image of her. And I think that kind of friendly, avuncular, future-oriented, optimistic feel is what they're going for, and I think they picked the right guy in that regard.
Will we see a vice presidential debate?
I hope so. I think Walz against Vance would be fantastic. Now, Vance is a smart guy. I'm sure he's an accomplished debater, but Walz has shown, I think the reason that he shot up the charts in the VP race initially was because he goes on cable television and he just has this incredibly appealing presence. And the things that he says and does are really compelling. And as you noted at the top, he kind of coined the idea that these guys are weird. And I really like the matchup of Walz versus Vance in a debate.
So we'll see if we get that one. We'll still see if we get Donald Trump and Kamala Harris sharing a stage. She, of course, agreed to appear in the debate that Donald Trump initially agreed to on September 10th on ABC. He now wants to debate on Fox on September 4th. Matt, if you were the Harris campaign or if you were advising them, should they go ahead and show up and do that debate on Fox? What is the strategy that you would suggest here?
You know, I don't know what they're going to do, but I hope they do it. I mean, she would dismantle Donald Trump. The thing that Kamala Harris is best at is standing up and prosecuting the case against a bad guy. I mean, that's who she is. She's a prosecutor. She's very good at it. We saw her do it on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And Trump as we all know, just lies his way and bullies his way through these debates. As long as she could get a word in edgewise, and if they turn off the microphones the way they did in the Biden debate, she could, I think she would have her way with Donald Trump. So I hope she does it on Fox, on ABC, anywhere the two can meet.
We spent a lot of time talking, Matt Bennett, about third-party candidates. Going back to the no labels situation, Third Way was deeply invested. More recently, it's been RFK Jr. And there's an update to a story that we were talking about around this time yesterday, the fact that he chose to dispose of a dead bear cub in Central Park while he was on his way to a dinner at Peter Luger's Steakhouse. Kind of a long story, but it's a real one. He told it himself online to Roseanne, of all people, yesterday. Leave it to the crack reporters in Manhattan. We have learned that the state's environmental conservation law has a statute of limitations, and RFK Jr. will not be charged. I guess we can say clearly now and honestly that Joe Biden will not be asked to pardon RFK Jr. for this crime. An appropriate end here to this story?
Probably. I don't know that he should go to jail for this, but I mean, the guy is a complete wacko. And I think it's very important for voters to understand that this is not his dad. He's not his uncle or either of his uncles. He is a person of his own, and he has some very weird ideas about all kinds of things. But if you gave AI computers 1,000 years, they couldn't have written a story this strange. He is a very odd duck.
I think we just found someone else in the weird category. Matt, you're throwing that word out for more than just J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, like Governor Walz.
How long this campaign is a going concern?
Well, and it also becomes the question. We've debated this for months now, Matt, whether or not the poll is from what was the Joe Biden campaign, now the Harris-Walz campaign, versus the Trump-Vance campaign. What effect, if anything, RFK Jr. on the ballots that he is on will have in November if he makes it that far?
You know, it's a really good question, Kailey, and we just don't know exactly which side will draw from. We may never know. We're talking about very small numbers of the electorate spread out all over the country. So the only voters that really matter are the ones in swing states who decide to vote third party. And some of them are going to be motivated because they're like super anti-vax and they're attracted to Kennedy and they wouldn't vote for either candidate either way. Those voters really are irrelevant. The people who matter are the ones who otherwise would vote for one of the major party candidates. And I think since Harris took over in this race, the number of people who call themselves double haters, who don't like either candidate, has gone way down. And so the risk, I think, has gone down as well. Not to zero. It's still a real risk, and we're still focused on it, but it's not as bad as it was.
He's vying for it still on Twitter. Producer James just produced a post from ex-RFK Jr. America's political divide, he writes, sharpens with the pick of Tim Walz for Dem VP. He called Trump supporters fascist and weird. And they, in turn, are calling him worse than that. Hashtag Kennedy24. Matt Bennett, I guess we're not done talking about all three of these campaigns. He's at Third Way, Executive Vice President. Matt, great to see you, and thank you for the insights.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
With the big news we were waiting for, it came a little later than we were waiting for. I was checking the phone at 5. 6, I looked again. Started to refresh at 7. I figured I missed something. Then I'm on the air with Tom Keene, still no name. But it leaked finally to the media, making us wonder, after CNN and AP got their hands on this, whether she was planning to roll this out on stage at Temple University or how exactly the thing was supposed to work. There never was a Twitter video as we expected. But it's done. Tim Walz, the headline on the terminal, Harris taps Minnesota's Walz for ticket in Rust Belt play, even though we're talking more lately about the Sun Belt, which is interesting. I should note, by the way, if you were with us earlier, I was asking about whether Governor Shapiro was going to be there. Producer Cece says he is scheduled to appear and deliver remarks, which should be interesting to hear the way he approaches this following his statement earlier. So who is Tim Walz? The governor of Minnesota with rural sensibility, 6-term congressman, coach, teacher, member of the Army National Guard. started to become known to people 2 Sundays ago when he appeared on CNN and showed up with the word weird. Here he is.
People kept talking about, look, Donald Trump is going to put women's lives at risk. That's 100% true. Donald Trump is potentially going to end constitutional liberties that we have, end voting. I do believe all those things are a real possibility, but it gives him way too much power. Listen to the guy. He's talking about Hannibal Lecter and shocking sharks and just whatever crazy thing pops into his mind. And I thought we just give him way too much credit.
Shocking sharks. They were wearing "He's Not Weird" t-shirts at the Walz rally last night. And this is where we start our conversation with Brad Howard, founder, president, Corcoran Street Group, Democratic strategist. I called you a brawler earlier, Brad. I hope that's okay, because I wanted to talk with somebody who knows what it's like to get into the fight, and the fight starts today. First, just broadly, this selection. I know that the progressive left did not like the idea of Josh Shapiro. They love this idea. Was this the right choice?
Absolutely. I think Governor Walz has shown an ability to appeal to rural Americans. I think he's shown ability to fight for families when he was governor. And I think he's going to be a fantastic vice president. And so would have Governor Shapiro. I mean, the fact that these two were the top two choices show the diversity of the ticket, both in geography, ideology, and approach to governing. And let's be very clear that Governor Shapiro is still on the ticket. He's on the Democratic ticket, and he's going to work his heart out in Pennsylvania to ensure the Commonwealth goes for the Harris-Walz ticket. And this is probably the most pro-family ticket we have seen in decades from either party. And so while Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are focusing on their extreme, weird MAGA agenda, you're going to see Kamala Harris and Tim Walz put families front and center.
You're, of course, going to hear about how he is a radical leftist from the Trump campaign, and that's the job of the Trump campaign, saying the same thing about Kamala Harris. But there's an undercurrent here, Brad, that we have to acknowledge. On the Hugh Hewitt show, J.D. Vance, of course, Donald Trump's running mate, was asked, Hugh Hewitt says, if it's not Josh Shapiro, that's because he'll be Jewish and because he's a supporter of Israel. What does that tell you about the Democratic Party if it's not Josh Shapiro? J.D. Vance said, quote, if it's not Josh Shapiro, I agree with you. I think that they will have not picked Shapiro, frankly, out of anti-Semitism in their own caucus and in their own party. That is a direct quote, and that's part of the narrative that's already on the campaign trail, Brad. How should Kamala Harris answer that, knowing that there were progressives who thought that Josh Shapiro had the wrong ideas about Israel policy and was not sympathetic enough with Palestinians living in Gaza?
Well, the only person that knows the answer to this question is Kamala Harris. And I think it actually shows how much she respects and appreciates Josh Shapiro and his time in public service and his position on the issues by elevating him to, the runner-up here, essentially. I mean, if this were truly a problem of anti-Semitism, she would have never put him in the top two. That's just a ridiculous assertion, particularly about Kamala Harris, whose husband is Jewish, and so this is just the far right, again, trying to bully people into doing certain things. They were trying to bully Kamala into making a decision ahead of her making that decision. There's only one person who can make this decision. That's Kamala Harris. She's going to make a lot of decisions between now and November and when she's elected president, when she takes the oath of office in January. And again, it is just more bullying from the far right of the Trump people. They are spiraling after their disastrous pick of J.D. Vance as vice president. I've never seen a vice presidential rollout go so poorly. Usually get a bump after convention, have a double-digit decline and drop. Just showcases the American people don't want what Trump and J.D. Vance are serving.
Well, there was also, you talk about the bullying. There was a little bit of bullying inside of the party. I don't know, Brad, what you were hearing, but you got Sean Fain going out on Sunday morning talking about Josh Shapiro not friendly to union labor. He was in favor of vouchers, done a wrong education policy. John Fetterman out there saying he's too ambitious. He's going to try to primary you in 2028. The knives kind of came out for the governor, didn't they?
Well, I wouldn't call that bullying. I'd call that a campaign. I mean, the reason why she did this process the way she did and presenting options for voters and Democrats across the country was so they could share their opinions and their voices. There were some concerns about, Governor Walz. There's some concerns about no matter who you pick, there are some concerns. But the only qualification that matters is this person ready to be president should something happen to the president? And when you look at Governor Walz, he was a member of Congress. He was an Army National Guard. He was a teacher, football coach, and a very successful governor. of the state of Minnesota. And by the way, U.S. News and World Report ranks Minnesota as the 4th best state in the country to live. And so he's got a strong resume. Josh Shapiro is a valued member of the Democratic Party. He will be on the ticket running on the Democratic ticket in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He's got a bright future ahead of him. But I think it just shows how much she valued what he brought to the table by making him, bringing him into the top 2.
Yeah. I'm guessing you want him to debate J.D. Vance. That's partly why she picked him, isn't it?
More than anything. I want Kamala to debate Donald Trump too. Donald Trump was running scared from Kamala Harris. I'm not to cancel the debate you had already agreed to and then demand it be on a super friendly audience by Fox News is hilarious to me. I just think it just shows the weakness of Donald Trump, and that anytime he's genuinely challenged in any kind of substantive way, he runs away from the fight. And Kamala Harris has shown every step of the way of her career that she's ready for the fight. She's going to prosecute the case against Donald Trump. She's not going to couch her support for families, and in that you saw that she picked Tim Walz to do so. So this is an election that I'm fired up about. I think Democrats have a great message. We've got a great ticket, and we've got a great pathway to victory in November.
I know you're a fighter, Brad Howard, but what is the impact? What will be the impact of Minnesota Nice on this campaign?
Yeah, there's Midwestern Nice. I think we all know can cut 2 ways. There's a way of delivering with a smile that's very effective, and sometimes even more brutal than a direct attack straight to you. I've got a lot of friends in the Midwest. I'm familiar with it. I'm Southern. We were kind of expert at that, and so I think what you'll see is Tim Walz being a very effective way of presenting the contrast with J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. And, he's got a lot of credit for coining the term weird, and it just is. When you look at what they're trying to do, they're actually trying to take away freedoms from people and from families, the freedom of women to make their own healthcare decisions, the freedom from families to raise their kids and support their kids in the way that they feel is the best way for their kids, to remove books out of libraries that they don't think kids should be reading. This is, again, and you've got Governor DeSantis in Florida bullying Disney because they're not doing exactly what he wants them to do politically. The Republican Party is no longer the party that supports corporate America and the free market system. They don't want a free market system. They want a heavy-handed system that they control the morals and the values and the future decisions of these companies as long as it aligns with their political viewpoint. That's not the America we want to know.
Man, we got Brad on a good day around here. This is excellent. All right, so if just last minute, if the Harris campaign is labeling the Trump camp weird, are they also saying that Tim Walz is normal? Is that the campaign, weird versus normal?
I think what they're saying is the ideas in the way in which they're talking about the issues of this campaign are weird. Like, how does Hannibal Lecter and Shocking Sharks ever get into the rhetoric of a campaign trail? And J.D. Vance yelling at his son to shut up when he's on the phone, while his son's talking about Pokemon. Like, these are just weird things to be bringing up voluntarily. It's not like the Kamala Harris had an opera book and they pulled this out of it. They brought it up themselves. It's just very weird things. Like, as a manager, I would tell my candidate, like, don't ever say things that are going to pull attention away from your message and your policy. Can anyone tell me what the message and the policy was coming out of the RNC? No, it was just kind of a weird, rambling speech from the nominee that went on for way too long, and I think kind of ruined what otherwise was a pretty good convention. Joe, you and I were there. It was a well-run Republican convention. They were seamless and efficient and enthusiastic, and it just kind of ended on this weird note, and that's how they entered, the general election. So, I just think that you look at Democrats, we are putting policy front and center. Kamala Harris, every single speech is talking about reproductive freedom. She is talking about letting you raise your kids the way you want to raise your kids, giving you things like making sure kids have food on the table for breakfast and lunch when they're at school, so that you can't focus on learning if you're hungry. Like, little things, giving kids the freedom to live their lives as kids, to learn and to have a bright future. That's what's at stake in this election.
Never even got to the Diet Mountain Dew, Brad. We just ran out of time. Guessing Brad's had a Diet Dew. It's great to see you, as always.
You got the mental, Joe.
He's the founder and president of Corcoran Street Group. Brad Howard, Democratic strategist. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.